Warning, this video contains spoilers for all game titles within the Fabula Nova Crystallis project. Also, due to the topics discussed both in the Mythos and individual titles, there will be mentions and/or depictions of topics some may find distressing. Additionally, some of the footage used contains flashing images. One myth, countless stories. The new tale of the crystal. Anyone who hears the term Final Fantasy will think of many things. Chocobos and Moogles, crystals, emotional character arcs, and grand narratives where you will probably fight a god or godlike being at the end. For me, it reminds me of my first Final Fantasy universe, the first one I got properly invested in as a series fan, Fabula Nova Crystallis. And I'm pretty sure some viewers have just had a seizure. 2025 marks 21 years since Square Enix created the concept, a mythos scripted by recurring writer Kazushige Nojima that would form the backbone of multiple Final Fantasy projects. In theory. In practice, the mythos only cropped up in 3 settings before being unceremoniously forgotten. These settings were for Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels, Final Fantasy XV and its expanded media, and the complex mesh of titles that surrounds Final Fantasy Type 0. I'm sure several people are raising questions about the inclusion of 15, but I feel you can't talk about the mythos and why it faded the way it did without touching on 15. Plus, developer comments do still tie the game to it in a notable way. As with my Lara Croft video, rather than approach this purely from a development standpoint, I'm going to be analysing how the mythos was used, or conspicuously not used, in each entry. There will be some development tidbits, but I promise you that none of this is based on forum posts or hearsay like some videos on the subject who want to aggrandize certain aspects of this project. First, I guess a summary of the mythos is in order. There are a lot of elements which can make it difficult to break down, mostly complex names and twice as many proper nouns as most would be comfortable with. The basic story is a long-standing conflict between different deities. It starts with an ancient creator goddess, Muin, who is killed and supplanted by her son, Bunavelza. Bunavelza sought control, but the inevitable death of all things meant he wanted to control both life and death. He created his first child, Pulse, as a being to search for a way into the realm of the dead. His daughter Etro was originally created to aid Pulse, but a coincidental resemblance to Muin led to her abandonment. Instead, Lindsay was born, who both mirrored Pulse's search and protected Bunavelza as he turned to Crystal to sleep until his children had completed their tasks. Pulse and Lindsay created servants to aid them in their respective tasks, but Etro was left powerless and self-harmed to the point of death in her despair. Her blood was used to create humans, beings who, due to their origin, would inevitably die. Etro passed into the realm of the dead and received a message from her grandmother to protect the balance between life and death. To do this, Etro gave her human children a piece of chaos, a wild energy that could destroy all reality. Because humans held chaos within them, that maintained the balance between the worlds. The status quo is, Bunavelza slumbers in Crystal, Pulse and Lindsay carry out their appointed tasks seemingly in competition with each other, and Etro now acts as the goddess of death, protecting the world's balance. That, I swear to you, is the shortest version of this origin story I could manage without hysterical abridgment. In the stories related to this mythos, the servants of those original gods are, technically, also gods, but they often aren't described as such. The term used for them in the mythos is fal'Cie. Humans may be chosen by these divine beings to serve them, given a task and magical powers, but with some major drawbacks and caveats. That could be a time limit, centuries-long servitude, or a fate like death or something worse than death. These figures are most commonly called l'Cie. Also, think you could wriggle out of it? Don't. l'Cie who defy their appointed task end up cursed in some form, becoming known as Seath, or Shigai in Japanese. Speaking of fate, there is also a recurring theme across all the titles, regardless of how they use the mythos: divine fate. Different human characters are forced to be part of a divine plan, something summarised for Final Fantasy XV as the fate of characters burdened by the crystal's will, which applies across the whole mythos. How the characters react, whether they submit or rebel or are just carried along, is a core part of each story. Got all that? Good, because I won't be explaining it again. I also need to discuss how the mythos was intended to be used before we go any further. Multiple creatives related to the project compared it to Greek mythology, with one in particular, Hajime Tabata, comparing the use of the mythos to how Greek mythology was used in media. For an illustrative example, think of the Greek deity Zeus. He is Zeus, but nothing except an idiotic stretch of the imagination could make the Zeus characters from Clash of the Titans, God of War, and Disney's Hercules the same narrative figure. A different example that might be familiar to manga fans is Osamu Tezuka's Star System, which reused character designs and names with sometimes wildly different roles. It's a particular style of storytelling that can seem quite alien to Western readers. Similarly, the titles of Fabula Nova Crystallis were never meant to be connected in one overarching narrative. It was different interpretations of the same mythos. Etro isn't the same character narratively in Final Fantasy XIII as she is in Final Fantasy Type 0 or was in the prototype version of Final Fantasy XV. So, with that groundwork laid, we need to make a start. Final Fantasy XIII, along with the sequels XIII-2 and Lightning Returns, are what most people will immediately think of when Fabula Nova Crystallis is mentioned. It uses the mythos directly, lifting terminology from it en masse and heavily referencing or featuring the different deities. The struggles of its characters, particularly lead her in Lightning and her sister Sarah Farron, are tied to the wider schemes and fates of Pulse, Lindsay, Etro and Bunavelza. In the XIII trilogy, the exploration of the mythos is firmly on the side of humans and their struggles against divine fate. In XIII, the rivalry between Pulse and Lindsay means that the characters being branded as l'Cie of Pulse makes them enemies of their home of Cocoon, home of the fal'Cie of Lindsay. This relation of deities to different threats continues in each entry. In XIII-2, Etro's interference in the mortal world allows an aspect of chaos to gain a foothold, which ultimately weakens her to the point that she can die a second death and effectively end the world. Lightning Returns deals with Bunavelza reawakening and seeking to craft a new world free from the old one's perceived flaws, not realising that that's impossible. Practically every one of the main characters who becomes branded by the deities seeks some form of defiance against their role. Either they directly fight against their assigned fate, or they seek some kind of release from it. The role of l'Cie is painted as deeply tragic about 99.9% of the time, with the end result hardly ever being good. They either fulfill their role and become crystal statues until they're needed again, become mindless Seath, or find some kind of loophole that just requires the entire universe to be reset. I do like how the mythos is used in XIII, but it's probably more because of how the characters work than how it's actually told. There is an interesting aspect of ancient and archaic lore that ties things together, but the real draw is how the characters react and interact with it. How the core cast of XIII and many of their rivals deal with being the playthings of a destiny that will see countless others die. How Serra and antagonist Caius Ballard have contrasting reactions to their fates in XIII-2. How Lightning and Serra's lover Snow struggle with burdens both divine and human in Lightning Returns. But when you try and get into the mythos in these games without the character chemistry, its delivery can get pretty headache-inducing even for me. A portion of this difficulty with understanding can be attributed to Lightning Returns having a ropey translation and localization, which in some parts completely butchers how the mechanics of chaos and the human spirit work. It also nullifies aspects of the deities' roles and identities and makes things even more confusing than they already would have been. Thanks, Ikuko Tsuruta, localization director for Lightning Returns. You helped make the lore needlessly confusing. There's not a huge amount more to say, ironically. The story's theme and use of the mythos is pretty consistent. It takes its Fabula Nova Crystallis raw. So what about a title that was so watered down it lost all but the shadow of its taste? For those of you who don't know, which may slowly become the majority over time, Final Fantasy XV had a very troubled development. Beginning in 2006 as Final Fantasy Versus 13, it went through 6 years of constant issues including scale creep, bi-monthly rewrites, and tech changes until it was rebooted as the next mainline installment, and major reworking was done to get it released. As part of its restructure and rewriting, which included dropping 2/3 of its planned script and changing or removing a number of characters, how it dealt with the mythos was reassessed. The company needed the game to sell, so after much internal discussion, it was decided to drop the terminology of the mythos entirely. Some have interpolated that the mythos as a whole was dropped, but this has been directly contradicted. The mythos still served as a thematic foundation for the story, as the company would have needed to completely scrap the entire narrative and world to remove it completely. In the earlier Versus 13 draft, the only deity mentioned was Etro. She was the source of different characters' powers, whether directly or no. Basically, someone who suffered a near-death experience would be granted power from Etro's realm, but they would also see the dead departing and draw power from that. We don't know much more than that, and any further speculation would be falling down the same aggrandizing rabbit hole as many other creators have done. Another factor tied into their decision to remove references to the original mythos was their decision to cut down on more esoteric terminology and proper nouns, aiming instead for understandable language. In the world of Final Fantasy XV, the recurring plot point of a human chosen by divine powers to fulfill a destiny, whether they like it or not, is very present. Noctis Lucis Caelum, Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, and Ardyn Azunia all fall into the definition of a lessee, as they must fulfill different and cruel fates. Lunafreya is essentially a sacrifice to enshrine Noctis's journey, Ardyn is a target and focus for the darkness consuming their world, and Noctis is the true king, who will take on the light of his nation's crystal and deities, sacrifice his life, and purge the planet of darkness. By the story's conclusion, all three have died. Many who have played Final Fantasy XV may be thinking, wait, where was that in the game? And anyone who hasn't will be puzzled by that statement. The problem is, while the story is comparatively simple, it's told incredibly poorly. Many people will praise 15 for the chemistry of its core cast, but its main plot mostly happens off screen and its side characters get barely any screen time. This also means most of the background lore is vague to non-existent. It needed 2 years worth of spin-off projects, additional media and DLC content before I was able to summarise the plot as simply as I just did. Most of the stuff about the crystal's will, Ardyn's role and background, Lunafreya's burden, Noctis' wider role, is delivered with the most extreme form of obliqueness or through post-launch content. The role of deities is filled by the Astrals, and these 6 summoned monsters do mirror aspects of how the original deities behaved. They can be sympathetic to humanity or dismissive and cold. They rule and control the world, but seem incapable of directly interfering with catastrophe, so they use humans as mediums. Those directly blessed by them can use magic without any additional medium or constraint, but at a terrible cost. Ardyn's gifts eventually turn him into the perfect host for darkness, corrupting him. Lunafreya's gifts and role as the Oracle are slowly killing her, and Noctis' fate is ultimately as a sacrifice. Believe it or not, there's even a reference to Seath, although in English you know them as demons. The Japanese script uses the same phonemes, a deliberate callback to the original esoteric term, which was a wordplay on the Japanese word for corpse. So in Final Fantasy XV, the demon monsters who embody the darkness are literally walking corpses. Revenants, if you will. In relation to the subject of character fates, I must mention the spin-off novel Dawn of the Future, which was intended to be the final round of DLC for the game before stuff happened and 3 of the 4 episodes got canned. But the team still wanted to tell the story, so the drafted narrative was turned into book form. In this alternate timeline of sorts, Noctis, Lunafreya and Ardyn find ways to rebel against their fate, defeat the leader of their world's deities who seeks to control everything no matter what, and still save the world from darkness. There are plenty who hated this change, not only because of the circumstances surrounding the DLC, but also because its themes flew in the face of what the game was doing. It was even directly and negatively compared to the Fabula Nova Crystallis theme of defying fate, but I think that was missing the point. The mythos was about how people treat their fate, and that can include submission. So while the book does abandon the game's themes, the original game was also using the Mythos theme of divine fate and human roles within it, just exploring the other side of the coin, as per very early marketing. In a sense, Final Fantasy XV still fulfills its original goal of being the dark side of Final Fantasy XIII. Instead of a story where fate is defied and human will triumphs, we get a story where human will is irrelevant to the caprices of deities and the fate of the world. The crystal's will is absolute, individuality be damned. It is a deeply tragic story, and would be a lot more impactful if the narrative weren't as shattered and scattered as a champagne glass after a 10-foot drop. So, we've had one entry where the mythos was too present, and one where it wasn't present except in the barest essentials. But there was an interesting middle ground, and I think it stands as the best iteration of the mythos by far. Final Fantasy Type 0 also had a difficult development, going from an anime-inspired god-slaying tale into a heart-wrenching war story. And on top of that, due to market conditions, despite releasing for the PSP in 2011, it didn't see an English release until 2015 for then current home consoles. There's plenty to criticise about this game, especially in its current HD form, but I don't think the story's one of them. This is probably one of the best introductions to how Japan often tells its anti-war narratives. The beating heart of the story, both in relation to its narrative and themes, is Class 0, a child soldier division with unique powers and a destiny tied to the Agito, a saviour figure who will rescue Orients from the dark fate of Tempus Finis. In this iteration, the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythos is present, but it feels more like a consequential backdrop than an overriding presence. This was intended as a human story from the outset, and that shows. We get events from the perspective not of l'Cie or chosen sacrifices, but a sect of boots-on-the-ground soldiers. Because of this, the tragic aspects of the deity's actions are increasingly emphasised, although there is a maintained distance because of the story's framing as an historical account. The terminology's use here is sparse and adds weight. Here the l'Cie are revered and feared, technically immortal beings who act solely according to the will of their nation's crystal. As demigod-like figures who can exist for centuries before their task is fulfilled, they hold powers which could level nations if they were directed to do so. Two l'Cie clashing wipes out a whole city, a different l'Cie conjures a monstrous summon which decimates another region. These are beings to be feared, anthropomorphic weapons of mass destruction. They also will both submit to and defy their fates, with the latter often doing so regardless of the terrible monsters they will turn into as punishments for defying their crystal. In this setting, the fal'Cie equivalents are the crystals of Orients and their creators, Arisia al-Rashia and a figure dubbed the Masked Man in-game and Gala in supplementary material. These two carry out the conflicting wills of Pulse and Lindsay, and in the name of their creators' goals have trapped Orients in a cycle of repeating history, a cycle that, by Type 0's events, has repeated 600,104,972 times. Etro's role here is extremely subtle, hinted to be someone who allows certain characters to continue manifesting in the world through reincarnation, allowing fate to be changed. The ending is apt for this setting and tone, with a core theme being choosing how one lives life, and even how one may choose to die. The main characters of Class 0 have never been given the chance to choose how they live, so their mother figure, Arisia, tells them to choose how they may die. Despite being a divine servant, Arisia grows to care for her human subjects, and it is her abandoning Orients and letting it continue past the time loop which allows the surviving characters to build a happy future. She learns to love humans. The additional game and multimedia projects related to Type 0 all tie into the cyclic repeating history of Orients, but they also deal with themes of personal choice and fate. The three Change the World light novels are told from the perspective of characters in different cycles of history. In now defunct mobile title Final Fantasy Agito, we see the first two cycles of Orients' history, where different characters are subjected to divine will and even a little changing of sides. It very much plays into the tragedy of God-given fate and Orients' ultimate destruction during Tempus Finis. In Final Fantasy Awakening, another now defunct mobile project, the storyline was moving in the direction of the main character having the knowledge from previous cycles to potentially shift other characters' fates. These are interesting spins on the concept, but they never got a chance to be expanded. Each of the games has a definitive ending, and with the close down of Awakening in 2020, Fabula Nova Crystallis has seemingly been laid to rest. There are a number of factors as to why this project didn't work, mostly tied to the issues Square Enix's production and management divisions were going through during the 2000s to 2010s. There have also been critical and fan pieces describing the series as too much like the main series to be worth standing on its own, but I also think the way each game delivered the mythos was inherently flawed. In the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, the mythos was so completely in your face that it could become obnoxious, especially due to the amount of in-universe terminology we were expected to absorb. In Final Fantasy XV, they tried to backpedal on that in-your-face approach and took it too far, an issue made worse by its poor story delivery. Final Fantasy Type 0 was the one that balanced things the best, using the mythos as a core backdrop for a strong narrative, but it was sabotaged by how delayed the game's release was, coming out nearly 5 years after the initial waves of excitement had died. I know some people will bring up the 13 series' data log, which chronicled a lot of extra stuff, but Type 0 and 15 also had features like this. Indeed, most modern Final Fantasy titles have features like this, and I don't think it should be lumped in with how poorly the mythos was communicated. I also don't think it was the fact that this mythology had complex terminology and deep lore that was the issue. No, the crippling problem was its delivery, scattered and poorly explained across 3 core titles beset by development woes, and over 12 additional notable projects around them across an entire decade. Just look at the latest round of successful and well-liked Final Fantasy titles, including Final Fantasy XVI and Stranger of Paradise. They absolutely stick with the esoteric side of things and weave narratives and lore just as complex and thematic, it's just delivered in a much better or more memorable way. Now, speaking simply as a writer and a fan who would dearly like to try writing a Final Fantasy myself, yes, that's my unrealistic pipe dream, I would enjoy seeing Square Enix tackle this mythology one last time, to make an attempt at trying what they intended for one last game. Just indulge me for a moment. I think any hypothetical 4th title in this mythos would do best to once more focus on a human drama, and introduce the mythology quietly as a background element. Make the concept sound before you overload the player with proper nouns. Maybe hold back the original terminology in reserve as an archaic language, with the current age calling figures like the l'Cie something along the lines of crystal knights, servants, or even, dare I say, warriors of light. To help players get their heads around them, the deities would be known through honorifics or alternate titles, similar to how Greek underworld deities would often be referred to obliquely so you didn't catch their attention. So for instance, Etro would probably be just the goddess, Lindsay might be our sovereign or the protector, Pulse might be the mighty, Bonavelza, if known about at all, would be Allfather or Radiant One. Maybe they could introduce Muin as Primal Mother, Ancient One or Firstborn, since none of the other titles reference her bar one item name in 13.2. The deity's servants worked the best just as crystals with limited autonomy, so keep them as that. Rather than the national conflicts of other iterations, the title could explore a nation where 2 l'Cie share a mission but end up at odds, one seeking to escape their fate, one submitting to it. It could be a tragic clash of ideals and fates, with perhaps a final player-driven choice. Would you side with Fate's weave, or seek rebellion? Non-magical humans could also play a prominent role, likely as companions or important side characters who would watch the conflict play out. Perhaps a different l'Cie type figure could be a neutral force, a third party to add an unbiased perspective to the conflict. And at the heart, maybe a prophecy with an uncertain ending, hinting that an outside force must choose what path the world takes. An outside force that holds a controller, perhaps. At its core, the story would just be a Final Fantasy spin-off, with all the chocobos and moogles and monsters and Sids and tropes we've come to expect. Consequently, it will be allowed to go in directions the main series has only recently dared to, and it could have the freedom to truly explore a world where humanity are the tools of godly duty, leaving the ultimate choice in the player's hands. But I fully realise that's a pipe dream. The series and the fandom have mostly moved on from this unsettled part in the company's history. I have seen a renewed liking for Final Fantasy XIII beginning to appear as the vitriol is sorted from genuine criticism. 15, for all its issues, is now one of the best-selling entries in the franchise to date, and Type 0 remains something of a cult favourite among fans. I'd enjoy being proven wrong, but Square Enix seems to have laid this project to rest, so we can look back on it from a distance, not with rose-tinted glasses, but with eyes that see it clearly, like a cracked crystal, in all its imperfect, broken, unfulfilled, but still glittering glory. And that's it! I truly couldn't think of any other way of ending this. I've done all I can to sum up and summarise and help you hopefully understand this mythos and its relevance to different titles better. But otherwise, yeah. If you like this video, please check out the rest of the channel's content. Like, share, subscribe, boost even. Links in the description for my latest book. I've definitely got some Final Fantasy in my work. You will probably very easily be able to spot it. So, ladies and gentlemen and everyone in between, I hope we'll meet again. See ya!